Well, good evening, everybody. It is Monday, November 21st, 7:30 p.m. My name is Jackson Hudecki, and I'd like to welcome you to the Bird Study Group monthly webinar. The BSG is a wing of the Hamilton Naturalist Club. We're celebrating 36 years of science communication among an organization who has been around since 1919. And we're happy to be broadcasting to the 43 folks who are in the room and counting. Welcome. So the Hamilton study area is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. The land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes and within the HSA, of course. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1972 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And usually I like to highlight something that is occurring with the Indigenous and First Nations communities within our region, but something that is impacting all of us, no matter where you live in Ontario. There is something that is going on right now that is requiring all of our support and our attention and our dedication. My first couple slides are dedicated to what is happening to the land that we all care for, to the waters that we all care for, to the wildlife that we all care for, because it's going to require all 47 and counting folks here's attention and folks in your surrounding communities. So if you haven't heard of Bill 23, I hope I'm not the first to be talking about how important it is. But More Homes Built Faster Act is something that is going to be decimating a lot of very sacred and protected resources around us. And I say resources, I mean ones that are near and dear to all of us, and all of the living things that don't have a human voice. This information was taken from SaveOurStreamsHamilton.org. The Naturalist Club has a newly acquired board member, Nancy Hurst, who has been actively involved with several other organizations and campaigns and shared some information with me to share with you. So what's happening right now is something that is going to require some boots on the ground. This is a letter that is being encouraged to be written to members of your local and provincial governments, which can be found on the Save Our Streams website as well as an environmental defense website. But if you're not really aware of what's going on, they're really trying to undermine allow swift and quick action to occur where development can happen and wetlands could be infilled with very minor oversight. I've highlighted a couple of the things that are really key components as part of this bill. Prohibiting municipalities from accessing the expertise of conservation authorities. I mean, I've got several friends who work for the conservation authorities, and I know what work goes into it and their expertise. I can't imagine not using that expertise and not listening to that expertise. Removing a conservation authority's power to deny sprawl developers and land speculators a permit to build on wetlands, rivers, or streams or valleys. Removing conservation authorities' power to regulate or refuse permits based on pollution or the conservation of land. Compel conservation authorities to identify their land holdings and make them available for housing. Our taxes are all going to drastically go up. And when I say this is going to affect us all, and where I know that in the most recent election, housing and the housing crisis across Ontario is that we see it in all of our neighborhoods, in all of our cities. And this is something that's not actually going to help the housing and the affordability crisis, but to make it much worse. I've had some friends become rent-evicted, so they've been kicked out of their place of dwelling with the citing that there's going to be renovations happening, and then they're not allowed to move back in, or then they're upcharged significantly. And we're going to see a rise in homelessness in this, in the passing of this act, which is happening very quickly. I recently attended a rally, a protest, and I hope and I implore and encourage others to do the same, because there's a lot that you can get involved with in the surrounding Hamilton Study area, or the HSA, or if you're further afield, I'm not sure what's happening in Peterborough. But if you see a happening there, that means there is a protest happening near you soon. I got that from the Environmental Defense website, so I encourage you all to, it's time to put our boots on the ground and to stand together, and to raise awareness of what's going on, and to show that with this people power, we can make great change. So I encourage you all to find what's going on around you, but look up the Environmental Defense website, look up Hands Off the Greenbelt if you're doing some research online, and find action near you and go to it. It's just the start, and this has been happening. These gatherings have been happening every week now. There's further action coming up this weekend. This is the time to put ourselves out there. Make a sign. There's some really creative signs. So do some digging, do some research, and find something near you. And if you're listening to the radio on CBC Radio 1 tomorrow, between 12 and 1, there'll be a call-in hour where you can talk about Bill 23 and perhaps how it's affecting something near you. Raise your voices, raise your fists. Everything intersects, all right? So when we talk about the inclusion of all of the communities around us, starting with land acknowledgements, recognizing the Indigenous peoples that have been shouting this from the rooftops for ages, but thinking about the environmental crises and the housing crises, affordability crises, all these things, what's happening with the unions, what's happening with schools, what's happening in hospitals, everything's intersecting, and this is slowly but surely the fire that is rising. I'm encouraging you to get out there and join us on the front lines. That being said, today I lifted this from Joey Coleman's Twitter account. This is a Hamilton photo and a little blurry one at that, but this is the first day for new councillors and new mayors and incumbent councillors and mayors across the province to gather. So there's a lot of work ahead of them, and they know that these issues were big deals going into the election. Now it's time to ensure that you're connecting with them further. So work is to be done. Okay. I want to welcome everybody to the Bird Study Group meeting. This happens monthly, and we have a special guest tonight who'll be joining us shortly. I just want to get through a few more things before we welcome them. So how this works is once I'm done with some events and announcements, I'll introduce our speaker, who will have anywhere from 30 minutes to 45 minutes to sometimes an hour to share their presentation, where then we can ask any questions of our special guest. So you can add that in the Q&A, but feel free to use the chat function tonight, because we'd love to know what you're thinking. And if you've been to a protest or a rally or a gathering, let us know in the chat where you were and how that made you feel. Because it is empowering. And that's the goal of all of this. The goal of all of these presentations by the Naturalist Club and by other organizations like ours is to unite people. We want to unite our expertise. We want to unite our first-time beginners, because the more people surrounding a topic, the better for everything going forth. So that's the goal of the Bird Study Group, is to just bring people together about a topic pertaining to birds or something that involves all of us. Bird activity in the HSA in late October and early November. Thanks to Colleen Riley, we got this great picture of a northern gannet. Holy smokes. So I think it was the day of the Allen Wormington fall bird count. We encountered, or some folks encountered, a northern gannet, and as well as some cave swallows. The intrepid Marcus Legsdons was kind of chit-chatting at the end of October, I think, saying, people are chatting about cave swallows showing up here at some point due to some northerly winds or coming from the south. And I was like, oh, cool. And sure enough, a couple flocks of cave swallows were seen around here. So that was pretty incredible. Throughout the last couple of weeks, we have encountered evening grosbeak. I feel like I haven't heard much of them lately around the Hamilton Study area. So if you have had evening grosbeak recently, let us know when. Let us know where. Mary Beth and Dave, we took part in Bill 23 protest in Pickering on Saturday. Yes, that's awesome. Thank you. Feel free that when you do mention something in the chat where it says to, drop down and click everyone, because right now, Mary Beth, just I can see that. But if you put it if you click it to everybody, then we all can see. And if you have a raised hand, just throw comments in the chat. We'll be able to read it there. just for the sake of time. There has been a black vulture seen in the study area located in Dundas. If you want to know why vultures hang out where they hang out in Dundas, there's a crematorium actually right there. I suspect folks say it's because of the warmth at the top of the building. I think it has to do with the smell, but that's just a hunch. So black vulture, Pomeranian Jaeger, 3 cattle egret were seen in a very precarious spot. Thanks to last month's presenter, Bob Curry, for alerting folks to a stormwater pond, I think along the Red Hill Creek or the Link, perhaps, where 3 cattle egret were staged for the day. A very quick sighting of a purple sandpiper at Van Wagner's Beach last week. Is the western kingbird around? I mentioned it last month, and I haven't heard much of it lately. So is it around right now? Let me know. Black-legged kittiwake was seen again. Some snow geese. And in Niagara, there's been a Townsend's warbler and a limpkin in the last month. Now, the limpkin is the contentious one because I haven't checked recently, actually, but it was seen on the other side of the river. So I don't think it's technically crossed yet into Ontario, but I haven't checked the Discord channels to know if not. What are you seeing? What's been exciting about your November birding so far? And what are your targets leading into the end of the year? And we'll talk a little bit about that next month, I'm sure, with the birds you want to see before the end of 2022. What was picked up by Rehab ER? What's gone? The limpkin? Limpkin was captured. Oh my goodness. Being driven to Florida. Drama. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Kevin. I was not keeping up with what was going on there, but I'm glad it was picked up. It must not have liked the snails. So that's something. Recently, so as I mentioned, between last month's bird study group meeting and tonight was the Allen Wormington bird count. I know at the last week's general public meeting, Bill Lamont gave a bit of an overview of what he, as the official counter, observed from the findings of the bird count. But what were some highlights or lowlights, or what was your best bird? What things did you encounter during your outing in your patch during the fall bird count? That's when we encountered the Dunder and Castle. Myself, Matt Mills, Barry Coombs, Heather Hostin, we encountered 3 different flocks of evening grosbeak that day, which was pretty encouraging, considering that patch along Dunder and Castle High Level Bridge on some windy days can be pretty quiet and pretty loud by traffic and trains, pretty quiet bird-wise. So what did you see? What did you encounter on your bird count? We'd love to know. Before the snow hit. Yes, that makes sense. Good. They captured the limpkin before the snow landed. All that snow, the 6 feet 4 inches of snow that hit Buffalo. My goodness. If you want to get involved in the birding community and some activities and events, I've got a couple things lined up here. So the west end of Lake Ontario, IBA, or Important Bird and Biodiversity Area Count. Motherwell, who's in the call tonight, is the coordinator for that. So if you would like a patch, you can contact Chris, cmtrain@cmotherwell.com for details. But all these black dots that you see on the map here are various important bird and biodiversity areas across Canada, quite a few down here in the HSA. So we'd love to get you involved in that, and you can go stand by the water and count waterfowl and loons and grebes and anything else that you encounter in the west end of our Great Lake. So that's on December 10th from 9 until noon. From 10 until noon the next day, I'll be leading a leisurely birding jaunt around Bayfront Park, around that part of the west end of Lake Ontario. I don't think you have to sign up for it. You can just meet us there. And I think Bill mentioned one location last week, but I was kind of picturing the kind of parking lot area of the Bayfront Park specifically, which is right beside the waterfront trail. So looking forward to seeing what's around on Sunday, December 11th down in that area. Paul O'Hara is going to be giving and this is a January 14th outing, 2023, a tree walk around Dunder. A big oak tree, one of the oldest oak trees in the area, is growing in the Dunder and Castle parking lot, Dunder and Castle Park. So if you want to get a really cool walk around to talk a little bit about that area, This is for you, January 14th from 10 until 12. You meet in the parking lot by the pavilion. Dress warmly, wear appropriate footwear. Paul will share his knowledge of the area's human and natural history, as well as talking about the amazing trees. A couple courses or a couple other groups you can join. So once again, hosting an online raptor identification course. I know the instructor. I've had some friends take part in this as participants, and they've loved it. So if you want to learn about all of the raptors that can occur around here in Southern Ontario, this is a great course for you. Every Monday and Thursday night from January 5th, a bit of a break and wrapping up in early February. But again, I've heard great things, and raptors are always a bit of a bugaboo for folks, especially as they blitz by. So there's ways to register. So to register, please email the following 3 things to Keith Deeroff: your first and last name, your preferred email address for the Zoom invitations, and an e-transfer of $48. Registration will close on the last day of this year. So I'm sure this information is around as well. So follow the Niagara Peninsula Hawkwatch for more. And Catherine's super lovely. So enjoy that. Colleen Riley, another lovely person. So the Pipits are a separate group from the Naturalist Club, and they require their own membership to join. So you can register with the Pipits, and you can check out more about them, thepipits.wildapricot.org for more information. And so you can take part in some outings that are going on with that group. So I'm going to kind of just move through that quickly, only because I think there might have been some sensitive information on there. But Marcy Jacqueline will be leading the walk this weekend. So become a member of the Pipits if you would like to take on a whole new birding club. If you're shopping for Christmas, for a bird lover in your life, or you want to receive some bird-friendly gifts. I'm wearing a pin right now, which is kind of tucked away down there. Oops, and it's kind of fallen off. I usually keep this on my coat, but this is a lovely evening grosbeak that was bought for me a couple years ago by Fold It Creations. They've got a whole bunch of really cool, they almost look a little bit stained glassy, but there's some really cool birding content on Fold It Creations Instagram page, which I believe links to a website. Local birder Paul Riss. I know lots of folks wear a bunch of the shirts created by Paul, so you can check out the Punk Rock Big Year page on Redbubble, or just look up Paul Riss artist, and you'll be linked to that page pretty quickly. A lot of cool apparel there. And Birds and Beans Coffee, totally shade-grown and bird-friendly coffee for the coffee lover in your life. Consider supporting that organization and any others. I was talking to a colleague today about what to get family members, and one of the most year-long membership to Ontario Nature, and I received a nice publication every so often and some links to those pages. So consider that for somebody, especially if you want to get someone more involved in nature. But you could also buy someone, or even buy yourself or your loved one, a membership to the Hamilton Naturalist Club to continue to grow our community here, because we'd love to have you as part of the group to continue enforcing the awareness and education that occurs within the club. And it goes to supporting our employees and the efforts by our employees. So we'd love to have you as a member of the HNC. And then you get a monthly publication, The Wood Duck, sent to you. If you're vacating Twitter and you're looking for a new medium to scroll, check out Mastodon. The Naturalist Club has shifted over, thanks to our media manager, Deb Kelly. Lots of ways to get involved in the community through Facebook, Instagram, Discord, through Birds Canada podcast, as well as the local Songbirding podcast by Rob Porter. And the listservs, the Google groups are still very active. And then lots of groups in the region to take part in. And if you ever want to connect with me or Lou, and you have a presenter, you have something you want to promote, send us the information. We'll do our best to talk about it in these groups and in these webinars. Winding up, I should say, for our special guest. Our next public meeting will be on Monday, December 12th with nature photographer, who's going to be talking to us that Monday night at 7:30, talking all about nature photography. And just announced, hot off the press, Birds Canada is going to be presenting at next month's Bird Study Group meeting. So Sydney Shepherd is going to be talking to us all about the piping plover, little bird, big world, piping plover conservation in Ontario. So this is going to be a really interesting talk. While not holding a piping plover on the right-hand side there, that is Sydney. So she will be joining us to talk all about these super lovely birds. And what is happening with that species, which is we're getting a double whammy of shorebird talks, because tonight, as you know, our special guest, Olivia Maillet, is here to talk to us all about red-eye flight, secrets from the subarctic shorebirds migrating through Ontario. So we're super pleased to have Olivia here tonight to talk with the controls over to Olivia, and you can continue to add comments into the chat or put questions in the Q&A, and we're going to get to that at the end of Olivia's talk. So keep those in mind as we go through. Olivia completed her Bachelor of Science degree in Biology and Environmental Science at Trent University and completed her thesis using eBird data to model killdeer habitat selection in Ontario. She is currently a master's candidate at Trent University and has spent the last 2 summers in the subarctic working with a variety of shorebird species such as stilt sandpipers, short-billed dowitcher, semi-palmated plover, and lesser yellowlegs. Her current research is on the breeding biology and migration ecology of short-billed dowitchers, which would be a lifer for me, and stilt sandpipers. So BSG, Hamilton Nationals Club, let's put our virtual hands together for Olivia. Thank you so much, Olivia. Thanks for being here. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, how does this look? Good? Okay. So thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to speak to you guys tonight. I'm always super excited to talk about shorebirds. And share some cool research and photos from my time in the subarctic. So I'm gonna kind of split my talk into 3 general sections. First, I'll talk about the unique study site that we study these birds at, which is in Churchill, Manitoba. I'll get into some general shorebird migration, and then I will finally get into my short-billed dowitcher research. So this is just to start with Churchill, this is where Churchill is. It's on the western coast of Hudson Bay, way up at the top in Manitoba. So if you're a birder, you probably have either heard of Churchill or have been there if you're lucky enough. So it's right at that transition zone from the boreal forest to the subarctic kind of tundra. So I made this map to kind of illustrate what these habitats look like in Churchill. So it starts out with the lightest here is the intertidal and kind of coastal zone where you'd find things like Arctic terns and semi-palmated plovers nesting. And then the medium pink represents what's mostly like mixed dry and wet tundra, which is where you kind of find things like Hudsonian godwits, whimbrel, etc. And finally, the darkest part there at the bottom, the kind of dark purple, represents the transition to mixed boreal forest and kind of boreal swamp zone, which is where you'd find things like grizzly bears and lesser yellowlegs, that kind of thing. So just for a visualization of what this cool habitat transition looks like on the ground, on the far left is the coast. You can see Hudson Bay there. It kind of transitions to this dry lichen heath type substrate, and then it gets into these patchy stretches of fen and wetland type habitat, and then we get into the more boreal transition area that also has some swampy sections mixed in. Here's an aerial view of the coast of Hudson Bay. I took this photo from a helicopter. So it's nice and high up. You can see the ice is breaking up in Hudson Bay here. When that happens is pretty variable, but it's usually around mid to the end of July, and then that leads to the arrival of polar bears. So you might know that Churchill is the polar bear capital of the world. So there's lots of polar bears there, fewer in the summer, but when we're there, they're starting to come off the ice and hang out in the coastal areas in Churchill. So it's very neat to see these animals, but we also keep our distance and be safe. Sometimes we arrive at field sites and we have to leave and go home immediately because we don't want to disturb them. And they often have babies with them at this time of year, so it's pretty cute. And on the bottom left, I have my hand beside a polar bear paw print, just to show you the size. It's pretty cool. And Churchill's also known for the bugs in July. This includes black flies, mosquitoes, everything that will bite you. And then, yeah, there's a lot of bugs in Churchill. kind of disgusting, but I love it personally. The last non-birdie thing that I'll show you is these wildflowers on the landscape in July and August. They're so beautiful. It's a lot of purples and whites and lots of yellows. My favorite is the fireweed, which is pictured here, which I think is so pretty. And the wildflowers get incredibly beautiful in around like July and August time. So I'll move on to some stuff about shorebird migration. So because of the position on Hudson Bay, lots of shorebirds migrate through the Churchill area. This includes some species such as sanderling, white-rumped sandpiper, like red knots, that don't actually breed in Churchill, but they just move through these coastal habitats in the spring, and then again on their way back down south in the late summer after breeding in the high Arctic. And many shorebirds do breed in Churchill, and it's in a variety of habitats. So on the upper left, there's American golden plover eggs, stilt sandpiper eggs. I found all these nests and took all these pictures, so it's very exciting for me. The redneck phalarope eggs are super little, like they look like sparrow eggs. The whimbrel eggs are massive, obviously. Lesser yellowlegs, semi-palmated plovers, short-billed dowitchers, and Hudsonian godwits too. And not pictured is things like dunlin. There's a lot of dunlin nests and lots of least sandpipers as well. Here's an example of what an incubating shorebird would typically look like in Churchill. It's a stilt sandpiper. So I took this photo during one of our regular nest checks. Once we find a nest, we go check on it every few days. So we're able to determine whether or not it was successful, so whether or not the chicks hatch. And when we're walking up, we realize they don't really flush from their nest sometimes. So we're about a foot away before it actually flew off of its nest. So this way, along with their plumage that looks like their surroundings, they can be pretty much invisible to predators while they're incubating. So here I've kind of taken a slice of that original map that I made at the start, just to show a gradient of the shorebirds that nest in Churchill. So in the coastal habitats, we've got things like semi-palmated plovers, killdeer. The tundra and wetland areas host redneck phalaropes, dunlin, whimbrel, short-billed dowitchers, Hudsonian godwits, some stilt sandpipers, lesser yellowlegs, Wilson snipe, least sandpipers, and American golden plovers. And then in the boreal kind of forest, swampy zone, we've got short-billed dowitchers, lesser yellowlegs, and Wilson snipe. And then semi-palmated sandpipers used to nest in Churchill, but they no longer do, sadly. And because of the access to Churchill via plane and rail, it makes it relatively easy for a Arctic or subarctic site compared to many of the other sites in northern Canada. There's relatively easy access here. So there's also lots of research that goes on. So for example, on the semi-palmated plover, my supervisor, Erica Knoll, has been doing a study there since 1986. And so many birds have been banded for this study. So over 3,000 birds have been banded. About 40% have been adults and 60% have been chicks. It's the longest running shorebird study in North America, which is pretty crazy. So it's pretty cool in Churchill, there's a pretty high percentage of the birds that you would see day to day, like if you go birding, that are banded, and a lot of them are shorebirds. So unfortunately, a lot of the research on shorebirds has been initiated because they are declining. If you've seen this, the recent State of the Birds report just came out, and in the US, shorebirds have lost 33% of their population since 1980. If you don't recognize this, I've just highlighted the shorebird line, so it's more obvious for you. But the same study also identified a list of tipping point species, which are species that have lost over 50% of their population in the last 50 years, and they're projected to lose another 50% in the next 50 years if nothing changes. And unfortunately, many of the shorebirds nesting in Churchill have been identified as these tipping point species, so I've highlighted those in yellow. So that would be the whimbrel, short-billed dowitcher, American golden plover, lesser yellowlegs, and stilt sandpiper. I've also listed here whose populations have been identified as declining. So really the only ones that are not declining are the semi-palmated plover, whose population is listed as stable, and the Wilson snipe, whose population is listed as increasing. But everything else is declining, whether it's in Churchill or it could just be across their entire range. And because many shorebirds are migratory, it means they're moving to different parts of the world to breed and also to spend their winter. So when addressing their population declines, it's really important to look at multiple stages of their annual cycle. And in migratory shorebirds, this typically consists of first breeding in further north areas, such as the subarctic and arctic, and then migrating south, and then making stops to refuel sometimes, before making their way to their non-breeding sites where they'll spend their winter months. And these sites are often in the southern US and Central and South America. And then they migrate north and do it all over again. So I'll get into my short-billed dowitcher research now. And a disclaimer, if you came here to listen to Stilt Sandpiper research, I'll have to disappoint you. I've got a bit about them, but I haven't analyzed their radio transmitter data yet because they seem to really like to just get rid of their radio tags basically immediately, which is great news for me. But over the last 2 summers, I've found their nests and conducted the same research as I've done on the short-billed dowitchers, just so you can see some cute photos. The chick in the middle there, and actually the pile of chicks as well in the center. They're less than 6 hours old. So you can see the chick on the top still has its little egg tooth, which it used to crack the egg open to get out and hatch. Super cute. And then the one on the far right on the top is about 4 days old. So they grow very, very quickly. It's because there's a very short season in the subarctic. So everything happens very quickly. Like they leave the nest and start running around and running up to like a kilometer away within the first few days. So it makes them very hard to track. So I'll get into the short-billed dowitcher. They're short-billed dowitchers, a medium-sized shorebird. They're an intermediate distant migrant, meaning they migrate about 3,000 to 6,000 kilometers, although it's not really known how far they do migrate individually. And despite the fact that they've got that really long bill, the long noodle nose, in the 1950s, they were split from the long-billed dowitcher. And actually, I learned this the other day, they diverged 4 million years ago, which is also pretty cool. And there's 3 subspecies of short-billed dowitchers with distinct plumages and migratory patterns, but they're also poorly known. So they do breed in these black fly and mosquito-ridden muskegs and fens in remote locations in Canada. And there's not many known breeding areas, and really the research on their breeding biology only comes from a few of them, including some research from the 1930s, 1960s, and 1990s in Churchill. So their breeding range, the western subspecies breeds in Alaska, northern BC, and the Yukon. The central subspecies breeds in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and as well on Hudson Bay in Churchill. And the Atlantic subspecies breeds in northern Quebec, Ontario, and there's likely a zone of overlap in the western Hudson Bay with the central subspecies and the Atlantic subspecies. So they spend their winter months in the southern US and both coasts of Central and northern South America. And like many shorebirds, they've got this biparental care. So both the female and the male actually incubate the nest. So usually we would just imagine in the animal kingdom, usually the male just leaves immediately, but it's actually the male who does most of the work in this species, so it's pretty funny. For incubation, the female only incubates about 10 to 33% of the time, so the male actually does incubate a lot more. And for chick rearing, as soon as the chicks hatch, the female departs very soon after. Sometimes it's even before. She doesn't want anything to do with raising the chicks. And that means the male has to stick around and raise the chicks until they're about 14 to 18 days old, although that's before they're flying. So the male also leaves before the chicks have fledged. And this photo is very cute. We've got a chick that's freshly hatched. It's still actually wet. And you can see its siblings are still in their eggs, but they've poked little holes and they're almost out. So as far as shorebirds go, short-billed dowitchers would fall in kind of like a habitat neutral to habitat rebel in the alignment chart. So they are frequently seen on shores, but they don't nest on beaches like a habitat purist, like a piping plover. So they actually breed quite far inland. So they breed in wet sedge meadows at the tree line and in open boreal swamp type habitats. And they nest on these hummocks, which are these small kind of dryish mounds on the ground. And the way they make their nest, the male goes onto one of these hummocks. He chooses a great one. He crouches and pushes his chest into the hummock, into the grass until it forms a little cup. And then that's where the female lays the eggs, and then they take turns incubating for about 21 days. As I said before, short-billed dowitchers are one of the species that is in decline. In Churchill, the IUCN has listed them as least concern, but they're also decreasing. They're also under review by COSEWIC in 2022, so that's also exciting, part of the reason I'm doing this research. And so they were hunted in the 19th century, and the population declined drastically, but then they've rebounded in the 20th century. But now we're seeing that population decline once again, but it doesn't seem to be related to pressure from hunting, because that doesn't seem to be an issue for them right now. Another problem is they're very sneaky. So within their breeding grounds, at least, it's very hard to know how their populations are changing year to year, because they're just really hard to find. So if no one's able to find them in their nests, it's pretty hard to tell how they're doing. And if you remember from the annual cycle slide, a bird's annual life can be divided into 4 parts. And at each part, we can study different aspects to kind of try to diagnose why they might be declining. Just as some examples, in the non-breeding season, we can look at things like wintering sites, quality of wintering habitat, foraging ecology, things like predation. During migration, we can look at things like timing, so when they're leaving, the migratory pathways, what they're going through on migration, whether they're making stops or if they're doing direct flights. And then in breeding, in the breeding season, we can look at things that might affect nest success. So things like nesting habitat or incubation behavior, and how the birds deal with predation. So my research just really focuses on those first 2 at the top, events that are happening in their breeding season and events that are happening on their southbound migration immediately after their breeding. So I'm going to focus on the migration aspect of my research today because I've recently analyzed these data and I think it's some of the coolest stuff to see. So I'm looking at the pathways, speed, and departure dates of short-billed dowitchers migrating south from Churchill. What we expected was that short-billed dowitchers might first migrate to James Bay. There's not that many short-billed dowitcher sightings in James Bay at this time, but based on flight bearings from previous research and just generally where it makes sense for them to go, it would make sense that they would first fly in that direction. So that was our prediction. And then they would first hit the Atlantic coast in the North Atlantic, because just as a straight shot from Churchill, it makes sense to go that way. And if this is true, we should see this from the tracking data. For their speed, we expected that they'd make stopovers. Obviously, they've got a long way to go, so it makes sense that they would make stopovers maybe halfway through their migration. And finally, we expected males and females to leave at different times. This is based on their varying incubation duties. So males should leave later than females because they have to stick around after hatch and raise the chicks. So you don't really have to understand any of that. My main question is where, when, and how fast they go on migration. So what's interesting about the Churchill population of short-billed dowitchers is that even though they're generally considered to be part of the central subspecies, they're somewhat isolated geographically from the rest of that central population in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And they're physically kind of in the middle, maybe even closer to the Atlantic subspecies. So predicting where their migratory pathway might be is quite interesting. So over the last 2 summers, we've conducted most of our work at a site about 8 kilometers south of the coast of Hudson Bay in the Churchill area. We had a couple of others closer to town, other sites, but we spent most of our time at this site called the Fen. So this site is locally known as the Fen. It's classified as a wet sedge meadow with very sparse black spruce and tamarack trees within it. And they're not very tall. So in the subarctic, most of the trees are under 2 meters at our sites. And really most of them are also under half a meter. But the Fen itself is about 8 kilometers squared in total area, but the actual area that we search is closer to 4.5 kilometers squared of quite wet, hummocky terrain, like you can see in this photo. So all the birds that nest in the Fen nest atop these hummocks. It kind of looks like they're floating, but they are in the ground, and the water is pretty deep there too. So you can probably guess that the terrain's hard to move through, especially later in the season when the ice below melts and dries up, and the mud becomes really thick. And short-billed dowitchers are quite sneaky birds. On the bottom left there's a nest in that photo, and you would never know from above. They're just very sneaky, and they don't let on where their nest is either. And it's not just us who have a hard time finding their nests. Here's 2 quotes from someone who studied them in 1927, that the nests must be about the hardest of all shorebirds to find, and I do not think any system ever devised for finding nests would prove effective for the species. So I'm definitely including these at the start of my written master's thesis just to show everyone that it was hard. But it's because they don't fly up off their nest until you're about 1 or 2 meters from the nest. Even if you're within a meter, sometimes they won't. So just walking by sometimes isn't enough. So what we have to do is walk a lot and for a long time and just hope that we happen to find nests. So that's what we did. We found 12 of the 19 nests by just walking by them, finding them by accident, or it was on purpose, but it feels like an accident. And then 3 of the 19 by dragging a rope across some good habitat until they flush up and we can see them. We found 2 of them by hearing parents with chicks in the nest. And on days when we were really frustrated by not finding anything, we decided to bag the fen, our field site for dowitcher nests in Spanish. And this, for some reason, actually worked for us on 2 different occasions. So we found 2 of the 19 nests for my master's thesis by begging the field site for nests in Spanish. So maybe that's just what Rowan in 1927 needed to try that technique.
Hey, can I interrupt you for just 1 second and ask you
Yep.
what you mean by begging in Spanish?
My field tech just shouted, she just asked the fen, she was like, please. And then immediately a bird flew up within like a meter of us. So that's how that happened.
I wasn't sure if there was something more scientific than that. I didn't know if like there was something specifically in Spanish you were saying or asking for. I was going to wait until the end of the presentation to ask that, but I thought I'd interrupt just in case others thought this is something similar.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And I mean, I would tend to rather use scientific ways of doing things, but it's so hard to find their nests at this point. When I go next summer, I'm definitely using that technique because it worked for 10% of the nests we found. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, we catch the birds on their nest, and then this is a photo of me extracting one. And it's pretty funny, this photo. If you look at my binoculars, you can see really how wet and mucky the terrain is. They're not doing too good after this field work, so yeah. So once we catch the short-billed dowitchers, we give them a metal band and a unique combination of color bands. You can see the one on the left has 2 yellow bands, the one on the right has a black and an orange band. We take a few quick measurements to determine the age, the sex, and the condition of each dowitcher. On the left, I'm measuring its wing. That can be used to help determine the sex. And on the right, you can see I've parted the feathers by blowing on the underside, like on its belly, to see its brood patch. So this is a little featherless section of skin on a bird that provides the direct warmth that the eggs need to grow properly. So that's pretty cute. The last thing we do before we release the bird back to its nest, all very quickly, we just give it a radio tag. So these are very tiny tags. They only weigh about 1 gram each, and they each have a unique signature. So we trim a couple of feathers on their back, and then we stick the tag on the feather stubs. We send it on its way, and this way, when the bird molts in the fall, the tag simply falls off and it's not stuck with it for the rest of its life. So I created this diagram to kind of simply illustrate how MODIS works. So we tag the bird, we release the bird, it flies by towers across North America, that unique code gets picked up by towers, and then it gives me some information. So when I download this information, basically what I get is, this is short-billed dowitcher number 387. It flew past a tower at 11:30 p.m. on July 20th, and it was at Long Point. So that's just an example of the kind of information that I'd be getting from MODIS. And MODIS is quite wonderful in the Northeast area, at least in terms of coverage. In Canada and the United States, there's lots of coverage, but there's also new towers popping up every year across their range. So in this map, you can see each circle is an individual tower. And then on the bottom right there, I've kind of shown you Southern Ontario has a pretty good grid, so lots of coverage there. So to get into some of the results of the 28 tags that I deployed, 22 have been detected to date. A couple of them from 2021, I think, fell off pretty quickly. So we had some issues there, but all but 1 tag from 2022 has been detected so far, which is super great. So each line is an individual dowitcher, and each of those pink circles is the tower that they were detected at. So in the Great Lakes region, they're going as far west as Lake Superior and as far east as Lake Ontario. And of all of the 22 22 tags that were detected, all of them were detected in the Great Lakes region. So that's pretty interesting where they're going through. And they all had their last detections in the southern US. So as far south as Florida, we haven't had any detections in South America yet, but still hoping for that. That would be pretty cool. So some short-billed dowitchers migrated first to like Virginia, some first to North and South Carolina, some to Georgia, and some to Florida. To zoom in a little closer to the Ontario map, where many of us are right now, many of the short-billed dowitchers I tagged flew by towers in southern Ontario. Some notable locations include Wasaga Beach, Pelee Island, and Long Point. And then close to Hamilton, we have Dowitcher flew past a tower on July 15th this year at Bin Brook Conservation Area. And then as well on July 25th, 2021, a Dowitcher flew past a tower at Russell Reid Public School in Brantford. So that's pretty cool. And if you're a birder, you likely know that short-billed dowitchers aren't super commonly seen in Ontario during the month of July. I just extracted this from eBird. It's just a map of all the short-billed dowitcher sightings submitted by birders to eBird in July of 2021 and 2022 combined. So it's really not a lot, considering all birds flew through Ontario. So why don't we see them? This brings us to the next question about how fast the short-billed dowitchers are going during migration. So looking at this graph, we can see the day of the year is on the bottom on the x-axis and the receiver latitudes on the y-axis. And at the top are detections in the vicinity of their breeding grounds in Churchill, Manitoba. The next detections are usually occurring in the Great Lakes region. And then finally, they drop off at around a latitude of 25 to 35 when the short-billed dowitchers are probably molting their feathers and dropping their radio tags. So the most interesting part here is to see how steep these lines actually are. So between Churchill, which is their breeding grounds, and a latitude of around 30, it's only taking them about 2 days to get there. So 2 calendar days. So it's very quick. And based on the time they were detected in Churchill versus the time they were first detected on the Atlantic coast, I calculated an average speed for them of 68 kilometers an hour. So it's very interesting how fast they're going. And taking a closer look at where they're stopping over, we had 4 detectable stopover events. One was in North Carolina for 13 days, 2 were in South Carolina, and 1 was in Georgia. So this may not necessarily be where they're staying for the winter, but because these are all the last detections for these birds, they're either dropping their tags after 5, 7, 9, 13 days, or possibly flying across the ocean to further south, South American or Central American wintering grounds where there's much fewer towers and they just may not be detected. So from this average speed of 68 kilometers an hour, comparing this to a maximum recorded flight speed from the ground in Venezuela of 72 kilometers an hour, we can conclude that it's very likely that they're not stopping during their first long flight from Churchill to the Atlantic coast. So it's not possible that they would have stopped in James Bay at all. And it's actually interesting, they're making their first stop on the mid to South Atlantic coast instead of the North Atlantic coast like we may have expected. And what's interesting about this is their initial flight from Churchill to the Atlantic coast kind of looks like a blend of the 2 subspecies. So the central subspecies are seen a lot in the central United States during migration, eventually in Texas and Mexico. And then the Atlantic subspecies, based on the numbers of this Atlantic subspecies that are seen in the fall, they're kind of congregating in the Maritimes and North Atlantic, like in Maine. But for the Churchill population, they just hoofed it from Churchill to North and South Carolina for the most part. And they're making this flight in just 1.5 to 2 days, and they're flying nonstop, so it's pretty crazy. And if you were a human and you wanted to do the same trip by public transport, you'd have to take a train and some buses. And if you wanted to do this without driving a car yourself, it would take you 6 days straight. So just to see how fast they're really going, it's pretty impressive. And lastly, I just wanted to look at their departure dates, which basically just means when a bird is leaving its breeding grounds after attempting to breed in a season. So I did this for 10 birds, which are each represented by black dots there. So with the departure date on the y-axis there, it seems like the males are leaving later than the females. And this makes sense because the female incubates very little. She provides very little care after hatch. She can leave as soon as she wants. And then the male, the male incubates most of the time and is solely responsible for chick rearing. So the male needs time to rear the chicks and fuel, get fat before it makes the first very long flight to the Atlantic coast. And so if female short-billed dowitchers only incubate their nests 9 to 33% of the time, leaving males to do most of the work, what do the females do for a month straight? They must be foraging because they're leaving so soon after incubation that they must be feeding enough during incubation to support that first 2,500 to 3,000 kilometer flight that they make to the Atlantic coast. So to just summarize these results, short-billed dowitchers did not migrate through James Bay or anywhere in that area like we expected, and we found that's physically impossible based on their flight speed. But instead, they're stopping in the South Atlantic, where they're probably molting. And as for the speed, we did detect stopovers in 4 birds, but because the tags fall off when they molt, we can't say for sure how many of the other birds did stop and where they did so. As they also start molting as soon as they leave their breeding ground. So even some start their head molt in their breeding ground. So it's pretty quick. So it does make sense why they're losing their why they're losing their radio tags. But with such a long first flight, also, it's very likely that they do have to refuel at least somewhere. And then finally, we did see that males departed later than females, which makes sense based on their incubation biology. And why is this important? Well, this kind of information is important to determine things like what stopover sites are important for declining populations of shorebirds. Because of the very high counts of short-billed dowitchers in the North Atlantic, at sites such as Delaware Bay or even further north in the Maritimes, we may have originally thought that these birds would be stopping at these sites and it would be important for this population. But what we see instead is that, at least for the Churchill population, they're first stopping further south on these barrier islands in South and North Carolina that we may not have originally considered to be as important for conserving short-billed dowitcher stopover habitat. As well, with this knowledge that they're passing over Ontario, it's important to kind of think about what kind of inland habitat we have available to them if they do need to stop for whatever reason. So to wrap up my talk, I just wanted to touch on a couple things that have come from our tagging efforts. So in both of these photos, I seem largely unfazed by the mosquitoes, which I am. I am immune to them, which is super great for working in the subarctic. But so that's partially why. But also I'm super enthused because these are recaps. These are stilt sandpipers that I caught year to year. So on the left is a stilt sandpiper we banded in 2021. And on the right is the same bird in 2022. So it nested within 200 meters of the nest cup it used last year. So that's very cool. And it hatched 3 chicks this year. And if you notice, its facial expression looks very similar between the 2 years. And then if you look at this next one, this one's facial expression also looks very similar. So by banding short-billed dowitchers and stilt sandpipers, we can get some interesting information about how long they live, whether they come back to the same site to breed every year, how far their nests how far apart their nests are year to year, and maybe one day things like lifetime reproductive success. And finally, some of you may have seen this already, but a tower that was put up in Leah Island Sanctuary in North Carolina detected 3 of our short-billed dowitchers that we banded in Churchill on 3 different days. So the same tower detected 3 different ones on 3 different days. So even though these short-billed dowitchers aren't migrating together, they all did choose the spot as an important place to fly by or to stop over eventually. So that's very interesting for their migration. And Audubon, North Carolina wrote an article about this if you'd like to read it. It's pretty cool. That's my field tech, Lucy, holding the first short-billed dowitcher that she banded. So it's also super cool. And yeah, so I just wanted to touch on how collaboration is really interesting. International collaboration happens a lot with migratory birds. So you get to kind of meet people who are seeing the same species that you're tagging, just at a different stage of their annual cycle. So that's pretty cool. And maybe other people who are doing the same kind of research, just in a different place. And I wanted to thank many sources of funding and logistical help. And I also wanted to end by thanking all of our amazing techs from the last 2 summers who came out to the fen with me to either nest search to catch birds or to do very tedious nest habitat surveys. So if you'd like to get in contact with me afterwards for any reason, here's my email. And if you have Instagram, I'm at Dowitcher Queen. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
Woo! All right. Thank you so much, Olivia. That was amazing. I've got a few questions while we let folks throw some into the Q&A. I wrote questions down in order that I was seeing them. So when you said a whimbrel egg is massive, for anyone who hasn't seen a whimbrel egg, what is massive?
That's a great question because I say massive compared to all the little ones I study. So it's like about this big. It's bigger than a chicken egg. That's what I can tell you.
And so a short-billed dowitcher, then how big is that egg?
Maybe half the size of whimbrel. It's a lot tinier. Like basically when you're walking through the fen, sometimes you'll just randomly find a nest and you can tell which one it is based on the size. They're all very different sizes.
Interesting. Like thinking about how, you must be needing to find those nests. I'm sure that does sound like quite a challenge. In thinking that killdeer do a broken wing display, is there any sort of protection that a parent might have of their young, or did they just take off and wait till you're gone?
Yeah, that's something that a lot of people don't realize is it's not just the killdeer who do that. It's basically all of the shorebirds that do that ridiculous display. So when we do flush the short-billed dowitchers and stilt sandpipers off their nest, short-billed dowitchers are very, they really like doing the broken wing display, but they also do this thing called a rodent run, which means they kind of flatten their body and they just run through, I guess, the water. It's very noisy with their wings flapping. They run through the water and they kind of look like a mouse running away. So I think that's the hypothesis of why they do that, is that they're pretending to be a mouse, which is an easier snack than a bird, maybe. Yeah.
And that led me to my next question about predators and predation. Who are some of the main predators up in Churchill of shorebirds in general, or of specifically short-billed dowitchers?
Yeah, really, there's not a lot of research on who's actually eating the short-billed dowitchers specifically yet. And I can't say that I have covered that knowledge gap in the last 2 years either. But in general, it's things like ravens, parasitic yagers. I do really think parasitic yagers did eat one stilt sandpiper nest. because the Stilt Sandpiper nested 50 meters away from the parasitic Jaeger nest, which maybe they didn't know. It was just not a great location. But yeah, things like that. And also red foxes seem to be also eating their nests. I think semi-palmated plovers have some other things that are going on, like red foxes. And as well, there's lots of large mammalian predators like polar bears and even caribou potentially that are seen in the area on like my lab mates. They have game cameras. So it's a very wide range of predators out there.
I mean, being so close to polar bear, that must be pretty scary sometimes. So good for you for being in the same domain as that giant predator. I've got some questions about Motus towers, but I know that there are a couple that still kind of pertain to chicks. So Rosemary wonders, how old are the chicks when they migrate?
Well, so they migrate after their first summer. So I guess they're left alone by the dad on about day 16 to 18. And then they kind of forage alone. At that point, they can fly. And then I know there's juvenile short-billed dowitchers that move through the area around I would say more like mid to late July. So I think that's when they're leaving. No one's put radio transmitters on the juvenile short-billed dowitchers in Churchill, so I can't speak to that. But I know there's some other research going on with juvenile short-billed dowitchers, which is pretty cool.
And the fact, and I want to get you to share the name. You said that was it your professor? Who has the longest running shorebird monitoring? What did you say? Who was that, and what is that? What is she doing?
That's my supervisor, Erica Knoll at Trent University. She's been doing the semi-palmated plover study for a very long time, since 1986. Erica Knoll. She's very cool. She's the true shorebird queen. Yeah.
When you had mentioned that, I thought like, okay, that sounds like a topic for another time to invite Erica down to the BSG. So thanks for that name drop. Cool. Okay, moving along. So Peter Tome says, since the females seem to depart breeding grounds 10 days or so earlier than males, are you aware of any advantage this gives them in making their flight south? Did they go further or faster, for example?
That's a great question, and I'm really excited to look into that, about like why or where they're going, if it's different than the males. Just based on some preliminary stuff where I've mapped where the females go and where the males go, I don't really see a difference in where they're going. So I initially thought maybe the females would be going somewhere different, but no, there doesn't seem to be a difference so far, although I am excited to look at the timing. And I'm also interested in seeing whether the females or males might be going faster. Again, I have a pretty small sample size, and even with my small sample size, even fewer birds were detected in both Churchill and the Atlantic coast. So that also limits me a little bit, but I've been able to do that for 8 birds. So it's
Cool.
exciting for me. They're so rare, so any bird, any number is fine.
That said, Ian in the chat has put a link down to several short-billed dowitchers photographed on May 29th in Colonel Sam Smith Park. So that you might want to click that link and save that Flickr page for yourself.
Awesome.
Is anyone doing this research in the other short-billed dowitcher communities, the one further west and the one more in the Atlantic side?
Yeah, the Western subspecies, there's a PhD study going on right now. It's a multi-species study out of the Center Lab in the US. So she's putting, I think they're GPS tags. So they're a little more specific than these MODIS tags, but she's putting these GPS tags on short-billed dowitchers. So we're planning to kind of like compare where each of the subspecies are going. So that's pretty cool. As for the Atlantic subspecies, I don't think there's anyone tagging them in their breeding grounds currently. I think it's a little harder to get up to northern Quebec than it is to get up to Churchill in Alaska. But I know there's folks in the Maritimes tagging juveniles on their way south. So that's also still cool to see where they're going after they're at these major stopover sites.
Yeah, interesting. I just wondered if there were other puzzle pieces that you're able to put together with other, and especially if you're the Dowitcher Queen, is there a Dowitcher King somewhere? Is there a Jester?
Yeah.
So I was also writing stuff down while you're talking about tracking. So I was writing some questions down about, and we did have Stu McKenzie from Birds Canada present to us a few years ago on the MODIS tower detection. How does that data get to you? So by that I mean, like, do you have to go into a system and recall it? Are you sent pings like that are specifically like, because there are tracking devices on multiple birds out there, so these towers are picking up several species. How does the short-billed dowitcher information get to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what happens is people set up towers. It's anyone from across the world, really. Like any organization can put in the funds to get a tower set up. So then when a bird flies past the tower, it gets recorded on a computer. Sometimes towers in less remote locations have them automatically updated, which is super cool. But a lot of them are in remote locations. So what happens is people like me have to go out to these random wetlands and then hook up the computer and then download all that data onto the computer, which you then have to go onto the MODIS website, upload it there. And then for me as a researcher, I have to take it back. So I actually go into R Studio, the coding program, and then there's a bunch of code that I have to run that extracts it from the cloud, basically. And then it's there in my computer for me to use. So it is kind of a long process to get it in. And even now, like even in the last week, there's been some more short-billed dowitcher pings from the MODIS server because of these really remote towers that are just out in the middle of nowhere, and people will only check them once a year. So I'm still getting data right now that I still have to clean and look at, which is cool. So I'll still be getting data until next spring. It's just, I just have to be patient.
That's cool. I didn't know how easy it was to access that science. We've got someone working on a bioacoustics project in the Hamilton study area, and yeah, they've got to go to the device to take the software out to be able to. At least I'm pretty sure. I'm not sure if that data or if that science has improved over the last couple of years, but I look forward to hearing how the MODIS towers do improve over time. I was even thinking how neat it would be to put a MODIS tower in the middle of Lake Ontario to see if birds are flying over that Great Lake or not. Because I know when you have them on the shores, that's one thing. Are they actually going over the water?
Yeah, I can actually tell you for sure. One short-billed dowitcher was detected at a tower, I think it was Pelee Island or Pelee something. I think it was Pelee Island at like 11 p.m. or something. And then it was detected at a tower in Ohio just an hour later. So based on those timings, it had to fly directly across the lake. So that's pretty cool information that we get from that. It's only one bird that I was able to detect doing that, but yeah.
Cool. We got several more questions, so I want to get to some of these. Mark Maddox says, has anyone tried using drones with infrared cameras to search for shorebird nests in the subarctic?
Yeah, I actually have lab mates right now in the lab, Erica Knoll's lab, who are using drones to look at like habitat for shorebird nests. So in the Arctic, I don't know about finding them. That would be pretty cool. Yeah, I can't really speak to that, but I do know that there is drone use in shorebird nests in the Arctic, at least.
Very cool. Yeah, I don't know what the ethics are even behind that. I don't know how high a drone would have to be so it doesn't disturb the nesting going on down below. And then if the infrared can pick it up from those heights. But yeah, again, advancements in technology, who knows what we'll see in a couple years. Robin Jones has, Robin has two questions. Could you be more specific about the age of the chicks when they migrate, 4 weeks or 8 weeks? But the second question is, am I understanding it correctly that there are three waves of migration, the females, the males, and the young ones?
Yeah, so the age of the birds, I'm not really sure. It's kind of hard to know without actually putting radio transmitters on them, sure. Or even just reciting them with the bands. I think it makes sense that they'd probably be, like if they're hatching they hatch around June 30th is kind of the average date that I have for the last 2 years. And then they start flying when they're about 17 or 18 days old. And then I think it's just approximately a week or two after that when they leave. So they're migrating probably like somewhere around 5, 6 to 8 weeks of age. And then, so for the waves of migration, that's absolutely correct. So before my study, that's really what has been known about short-billed dowitchers is that first the females come through. Previous researchers collected dowitchers during migration and then sexed them and were able to tell that they were females coming through initially. And then eventually the males come through, and then after that, that's why we see a lot of juvenile shorebirds later on in the season and in the fall. For dowitchers at least, you can tell they're juveniles based on their plumage, so that's one way of knowing.
Cool. Awesome, thank you. I've got kind of two back-to-back questions here. Karen wants to know what is their main food source, and Peter suggests or asks what is the weight loss during the flight to the Atlantic coast?
Awesome, those are great questions. I have not looked into the weight loss, but that's a great idea. I know based on previous papers, they have included potential metabolic rates and stuff for, a lot of the research is kind of a blanket of short/long-billed dowitcher, because a lot of it has been done without knowing exactly which species it is, but that's very interesting, and I'd like to look into that. But their main food source, in their breeding grounds, I think they take almost equal parts aquatic invertebrates and insects, kind of like when they're raising their chicks, they're kind of gleaning insects off of the vegetation. It looks pretty funny sometimes when they're walking around and eating off the vegetation. They'll kind of like trip onto their food because they're reaching to get it. It just looks really goofy, but I know they also eat a small percentage of seeds and also I think it's a small percentage of plant matter as well. So that's what they eat in their breeding grounds. And then on migration, I think they eat mostly aquatic invertebrates at that point. I haven't studied their diet, but I know other people have. So yeah, that's what I know about their diets.
Sounds like there's a few topics that can still be discovered here. I mean, Peter also suggests that the effectiveness of begging in Spanish to find short-billed dowitcher nests may be a PhD project unto itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, looking at the picture you have there, yeah, the areas in which they're getting food are quite different. I mean, we do know that finding shorebirds is you're looking for those big mud flats or sand. And you don't really see that in that initial picture, so they must have a pretty diverse diet. But yeah, the probing that you see a lot of them doing, especially around southern Ontario, does not look like it's in areas like that. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, they definitely don't. They do probe in this area, but I think they're taking a lot more insects, like mosquitoes, obviously, in Churchill, um, in the later point of the year. A lot more land insects than the aquatic insects.
Um, Wrapping up here, there's a few other questions in the chat. Peter Langbala wants to know, is it possible that the females have multiple nests, each tended by a different male?
So that has not been observed in short-billed dowitchers. I think generally in shorebirds, there's just a few that do that. So I haven't seen that happen. Although two of my field techs last year did witness a pretty funny event that happened when they were banding chicks at a nest. We had two banded adults trying to get the chicks back, obviously. So then they left their nest that still had eggs in it, like one or two eggs in it. And then random dowitchers from who knows where came in to kind of like try to help them, because they do think we're eating them. We're not. So they came in to try to help. And then one of the unknown unbanded dowitchers just started incubating the nest that still had eggs in it.
Wow.
So it is kind of weird. I asked my supervisor about it, and she said that it is probably hormones. Their
Interesting.
hormones are all raging at that time of year, so they do silly things like that.
Interesting. I was just listening to the Warblers podcast about piping plovers, and there's an interesting story that I think we'll learn about next month, perhaps even just a little bit, about unusual behavior that occurs. But and this was between two females and no male, and the females ended up having eggs. You can listen to the Warblers podcast for actually that whole story, which if you haven't listened, Bird Study Group, I encourage you to take a listen to that. Another question has popped up. Rosemary says, what is their call sound? I don't know if Olivia wants to mimic that right now.
Yeah, I mimic it all the time, honestly. It's the cutest sound. They can actually be distinguished from short-billed and long-billed can be distinguished in the field by their little call sound. And for short-billed dowitchers, their general kind of like alarm call is like whoop, whoop, whoop. It's like a doo-doo-doo kind of sound. But then once their chicks hatch, it changes. So it's actually a very good way of telling whether there's chicks in the area, is hearing these very specific calls that are kind of like doo 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 doo, that kind of thing. And they do these little murmurs and little chuckles. It's very cool. And these are just things that you learn from spending 2 summers with them. These
Sure.
very cool.
That is awesome. Thanks for humoring us with that, Rosemary. Hopefully that was what you wanted to hear. It actually spurred another question of the breeding grounds. So, like, you're looking for short-billed dowitcher. Did you encounter other species also nesting in your study plots? Like, are they all nesting kind of close to one another? Like, anything you can share about that?
Yeah, so at the site, the fen, I had a slide earlier about kind of what kind of birds nest in there, like redneck phalarope. So we did find all of those nests, mostly accidentally. So we weren't, following any other species. But one bird that was very close was whimbrel. There was a whimbrel nest that was just, I think it was like 15 meters at the most away from a short-billed dowitcher nest, which actually made it hard because we didn't want to disturb the whimbrel because we weren't studying them this year. So we had to wait until the whimbrel was done nesting to go back and do the habitat surveys. So that's how close they are. And
Cool.
Yeah, there's other things, other non-shorebird species, like savanna sparrows. There's a lot of those in the fen. Yeah, lots of shorebirds, and there's also parasitic yagers nesting in the fen, as well as Canada geese too. Yeah.
And they just nest everywhere. Okay, couple of final questions. Mackenzie wants to know what the lifespan of your Modus tags are and burst rate, which is a new term for me. So yeah,
Yeah, the lifespan, well, technically the lifespan is 120 days, which is um, very good for a tag. Um, and the burst rate, I think there was a range because we got tags from various funding sources, but it ranged from 8 to 10. So that means every 8 to 10 seconds, the radio tag emits its like unique signature. So really, the lifespan of 120 days is kind of a lie because they molt their tags off. But if they were attached in a different way, then they would stay with the bird quite a long time, and we would be able to see where they spend their winter. But the way we attach them is the least invasive way of putting a tag on a shorebird, so I I would like to stick with that.
sure, of course. That's awesome. I didn't. Yeah, that term burst rate is new to me. So thanks, Mackenzie, for bringing that up. And the last question I see here that I think I've answered, or I'm sorry, I've asked everyone that's been put out there. From Peter, Olivia, what was your spark bird, the bird that first got you interested?
Well, definitely relates to next week's talk. It was the piping plover. So like I think it was in 2018, no, 2017, 2018. My partner got a job at Darlington where this funky business with the plovers happened. And then I was able to go to a piping plover chick banding, which was really cute. And that really just got me into birds. And then I was like, I love shorebirds, and that's why I'm here now.
That's amazing. That's such a good connection. Yeah, so maybe you'll have to come back next month, Monday, December 19th, for Birds Canada, talking to us about the Piping Plover Recovery Project. Olivia, what's wrapping up here? It's 3 minutes to 9. What's next for you? What's happening when this project is complete? What do you see for yourself in the coming years?
Well, I should be finishing this up in about May, I think. And then I'm going to go to Churchill again this summer because my supervisor offered to send us up. And we're going to be tagging more birds. So that's my kind of short-term plans. I'd like to do more Arctic fieldwork in different areas. I love Churchill, but where we stay is pretty like deluxe, and I'd like to experience more of the rugged type fieldwork. And after that, I don't know. I'd like to do some more field jobs because I went straight from my undergrad into a master's degree. So this is like the first field work I've done. So I'd like to do more of that.
Cool. Yeah, because the older you get, the more you are stuck behind a desk anyway. So you might as well
Yeah.
enjoy the field work while you can. Awesome. And so finally, what does the rest of the year look like for you? So we talk long term. Where do you like to go birding? What are your highlights, or what are you expecting for the end of 2022?
Wow. I've been so busy with working on this, which is so ironic because it's birds too. I'm really excited to do the Purple Palooza in December. Go to Presqu'île and look for purple sandpipers. I've been a couple of years and still have never seen a purple sandpiper. So hopefully this is the year.
Never
And
heard of
just seeing,
I've never heard of that, but I've never heard of the Purple Palooza.
it's pretty fun. You should look into it. It's a big event every year, and it's getting bigger again now that we're having more in-person events. So that's exciting. So yeah, that's mostly what I'm excited for. I'm also going to go to New Brunswick this winter and see some cool seabirds and gulls and stuff. Just exploring now
Good.
while I
That's
have
great.
the time.
Well, is there any final thing that you want to wrap up the night with the Hamilton Naturalist Club in attendance here?
I just want to say how cool it is that you guys let me speak here, and also just to, I guess, leave you with the thought about the fact that where you're sleeping at night, the short-billed dowitchers in July, they're flying right over you. Whether or not you see them, they're flying through Ontario, so it's pretty cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and efforts, not just tonight, but in putting all this presentation together, and for all the field work and for talking to us. There were 67 people in attendance tonight. And so on behalf of the Bird Study Group and the Hamilton Naturalist Club, thank you so much. I've been getting text messages from friends who are watching, and people even in the chat were being very thankful for your time and efforts. So yes, as accolades are pouring into the chat, thank you so much, Olivia. And I look forward to hearing more about your career down the road sometime. Maybe we'll have you back when you're a doctor or who knows what to share even more information with us.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I had a great time. I'm always excited to talk about shorebirds.
Awesome. Well, with that said, everyone, it's 9:01. So thank you for attending our November session. I look forward to seeing you back in December. And yeah, maybe we'll catch some amazing, who knows, November and December birds between now and then. So thanks, Olivia. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your night. Take care. Stay safe. Stay inquisitive. Till next time.